Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and the US presidential election. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. I do my best to generally avoid political discourse on this channel. And one of the reasons is as a financial analyst, I already feel like I am dealing with two political parties on a daily basis in the cryptoverse and in the financial markets in general. And that is the political party of the bulls and the political party of the bears. And any video I make is likely going to appeal to one of those parties and make the other party lash out. And of course, it's going to be dependent on the views expressed in each individual video. So, all in all, I do avoid political discourse, and I'm sure you've noticed that on my channel over the last few years. But I will remind you that is not actually my first video on the US presidential election. In fact, it was exactly 4 years ago when I made a video called Bitcoin and the US presidential election. And back then we just looked at, what was the average return of the S&P 500, sort of going into the election and then just after it. And you can see that on average, the S&P just after an election, one day, 1 week, and 1 month later, on average, is down no matter which party won. But 6 months to 1 year later, on average, the S&P is up. And of course, we talked about Bitcoin as well. We talked about some other things like going through different presidential going through different presidents and looking at how the market performed. And of course, later on, we did generally talk about Bitcoin when it was back at $13,000. But in this video, what I want to do first is just say this, that I do not believe that Bitcoin's long-term success is tied to any individual political outcome. Now, that might seem like a statement that could make a lot of people upset, but there is this reality, and it should be a reality that you're actually comfortable with, right? If you have an investment in the cryptoverse, I don't think you necessarily want to have an investment that is wholly dependent on who wins an election, right? If you actually look at Bitcoin's history, we know that it launched in 2009, and the Democrats actually controlled the White House from 2009 all the way over here until 2017, right here. And then the Republicans controlled the White House from 2017 until early 2021. So what you notice, and then obviously the Democrats have controlled the White House since early 2021 until today. What you notice is that Bitcoin's trajectory has been constant no matter the political party. So that should appeal to you if you're an investor in the cryptoverse, right? To know that there is some element that the long-term success of Bitcoin is not tied to who wins a presidential election. That's at least one thing to note. In the short term, of course, there can always be effects by big events such as this one that are often completely unpredictable. And we've talked a lot about the outcomes going into the end of the year. There are two primary outcomes that should be considered, not just by saying the market could go up and down, but by looking at the evidence that supports both views. So, the first view that I'm sure many people are familiar with is just simply the cyclical view of Bitcoin. And the cyclical view of Bitcoin would show you that in every Q4 of election years, the market has generally gone up, at least for Bitcoin. That's not always true for the altcoin market in Q4 of election years. In fact, if you were to look at Ethereum and you were to look at election years in Q4, you will notice that in 2016, ETH actually went down in Q4, kind of like it's been going down so far this Q4, although in 2020, ETH actually went up. So I believe there is plenty of evidence to suggest that the cyclical view holds weight unless proven otherwise, right? Unless proven otherwise. If you look at the ROI from the cycle bottom, what you will notice is that Bitcoin is currently following the same trajectory that it's been on for the last several years. And at this point in the last two cycles, Bitcoin was also at approximately this ROI from the bottom. It was actually slightly higher at this point. If you remember earlier in the year, I told you guys that Bitcoin would likely cool off for 6 to 9 months before breaking out to new all-time highs, right? I said about 6 to 9 months was what I generally thought made sense. And the reason I said that was because back in March, that was when gold was breaking out, which is exactly where it broke out in 2019 when it marked the mid-cycle top for Bitcoin. There was a breakout by gold in 2019 and marked a mid-cycle top for Bitcoin. There was a breakout by gold in 2024, and sure enough, it marked a mid-cycle top for Bitcoin. So the reason I said 6 months was because last cycle, during the year that rate cuts arrived, it took approximately 6 months for Bitcoin to break through that lower high structure right there. And I thought, hey, what if it just does the same thing where it takes about 6 months in order for Bitcoin to break through the lower high structure? Now, of course, this also happens to correspond to the election, right? There's a US presidential election today. Obviously, there's also the House and the Senate. There's a lot of things going on today that will certainly affect things in the future. But I'm just looking at this from the cyclical view of Bitcoin that, hey, last cycle, it took about 6 months. And I feel like a lot of people are getting distracted by the political side of things rather than just focusing on the cyclical view and also the monetary policy view. So remember, one of the things that I said was that it would take about 6 to 9 months. Okay. So the short end of this estimate has already been achieved. And that's why back in back in September, I said that actually, I think it was back in August when we hit this low, I said that the 2019 comparison in terms of time has already played out, right? It's already played out. That's about how long it took in 2019, right? In order for this rally to begin. The only reason I did not just say 6 months was because I wanted to be somewhat flexible in case there is a landing. Now, if there is a landing this year, I would not expect it to be this bad. I wouldn't. But it is something that should at least be on your radar as a potential outcome. I don't think that we need to worry about the unemployment rate spiking to 10% in a month like it did back in 2020, which is what caused Bitcoin to crash about 62%. With that said, there are things that could occur that might make the market still pause a little bit and wonder, is there something still to be worried about? So, in order for the cyclical view to carry validity, to continue to carry validity, I think you really need to see multiple weekly closes by Bitcoin above 70K. The problem is that last week, it looked like we might get a weekly close above 70K, but then it ended up just being a wick. If you were to look at USDT dominance, which is almost like the inverse of what we just looked at there with Bitcoin, you can see that USDT dominance has been putting in higher lows since March. And so while on the Bitcoin chart, it looks like the market has already broken out, right? It certainly looks like it, that the market has already broken out. You can't really draw this in a way, at least connecting the lower highs to show that it hasn't broken out, right? It looks like Bitcoin has broken out from the lower high structure. But what's interesting is if you look at USDT dominance, you will see that so far the breakdown from the higher low structure of USDT dominance was nothing more than a wick down. And this trend line has not yet seen a weekly close below it. So, how does that make sense at all? How could Bitcoin be obviously above the lower high structure, but USDT dominance has not yet confirmed? The reason is because total market cap has not yet broken out from the lower high structure itself. If you were to just connect these wicks, you will see that there's not really that same obvious breakout like we've seen with Bitcoin. There is a wick up here, but there has not yet been sort of a confirmation that the rest of the market is going to follow along. A large part of the reason for that, I think, is because of what's going on with ETH. If you look at Ethereum, it's currently trading at only 24.55, and it keeps getting rejected by the bull market support band. Now, you might assume that ETH is a relic and has no place in future discussions, but I would humbly beg to differ. It is number 2 for a reason, and it's doing exactly what it always does on its Bitcoin pair, and this time, in my opinion, will not be different. I do think that ETH Bitcoin will bottom in Q4 of this year, just like it bottomed in Q4 of 2016, and how it also put in sort of a double bottom in Q4 of 2019, also years that ETH Bitcoin durably broke support from the structure set in the bull market. So I think ETH is the one keeping total market cap from seeing that follow through. If Ethereum were above its bull market support band, like the altcoin market or Bitcoin, then this would have already broken out. The question that I think a lot of people have to ask themselves is, which one is telling the truth? Is Ethereum telling the truth, or is the altcoin market telling the truth? Because the altcoin market, if you look at total 3, you could argue that the lower high structure has been taken out. So which one is ultimately telling the truth? In my experience, markets could change, and you could argue that I need to get with the times. But in my experience, when ETH Bitcoin is dropping, like it has been for a while, right? When it's dropping, usually the altcoin market also drops, especially on its Bitcoin pair. And that's actually what the altcoin market has been doing, right? If you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, it has been dropping. And in fact, it just set new lows last week, right? I mean, just a new low last week. I believe it went down to 0.34, right? And I've said for a long time that, it could eventually go down to 0.25, which is historically the bottom for alt Bitcoin pairs. So how does this work with sort of the election? How does it work with the cyclical view? And then, of course, there's also the monetary policy view as well. I think the argument right now that a lot of people are sort of thinking about is if Bitcoin can hold above these levels, right? If it can hold above these levels, then there's no reason for any landing at all. And if the political parties, if the political party, I think right now the markets, if you look on Twitter, and if you look on sort of the markets in general, the markets, I believe, are currently slightly favoring Trump over Harris, but it is still it's not so clear, at least by the polls just yet, right? I mean, there's a slight lead, I think, but obviously, a lot's going to change in a really short period of time. We should know the results hopefully soon, right? Hopefully it doesn't drag out for several days, but hopefully we'll know the results soon enough. But what I want to say is that no matter the outcome, right? No matter the outcome, there always is a chance of a landing, right? That could go whether Trump wins the election or whether Harris wins the election. There could be a landing, and I just want people to consider that view. I would argue that, and I've said this all quarter, right? All quarter, I've said this. I have said that it is foolish to fade the cyclical view of Bitcoin until there is evidence to prove otherwise, right? And last week, I said that I thought it was going to be decision time and that Bitcoin would tell us what it's going to do. And what ended up happening is we got a major wick up, making everyone believe the decision had been made, and then it came right back down. And so I think right now it's still a little too early to make that decision. You could argue that the markets are waiting for the presidential election to be behind us before they make that decision. But one of the things that markets do is they have you looking over here when you should be looking over there, right? And this feels almost like a classic example of that. One of the things I've mentioned before with Ethereum, and I've had some pretty bold views on it this year, and obviously a lot of people haven't liked those views because I've been pretty bearish on it, especially ever since the ETH Bitcoin valuation broke down. But in 2016, which also had Donald Trump running for president, right? In 2016, ETH had 3 capitulations. I remember all of them, and I remember feeling helpless here and wondering what was going on. Why was ETH Bitcoin bleeding still, right? What was it doing wrong? Why couldn't it go back up? Why not? Why was ETH USD dropping to a level lower than it had been at since February of that year? Why? And what ended up happening was ETH hit a low in April, it hit a low in August, and then it hit another low in December. And by December, so many people had given up on ETH. Not necessarily because of the ETH USD valuation, but because of the ETH Bitcoin valuation. It looked like it was never going to recover at the time. It just looked like it was going to fade into oblivion. But then in December, ETH Bitcoin bottomed and it exploded the following year. You see that? The following year. And I keep thinking people keep getting ahead of themselves with their cause for alt season. Normally, alt season doesn't occur until post-halving years. Now, this move here, also, if you look at ETH Bitcoin, what you will notice is you could argue that it basically just sort of connected the dots, right? From April to June to the end of the year. I don't know if you can draw something similar like that for this year or not, but what I do know is that if you take the trend going all the way back over here, you could argue that it's getting pretty low. And I do think that ETH Bitcoin will bottom out before the end of the year. What I think is relevant, though, is to really hone in on the final drop by Ethereum that it got in December. Early December of 2016, it had one final drop. And so I'm looking at the market today. And by the way, while Ethereum was dropping, Bitcoin actually went up, right? And also the dollar back then was rallying, just like the dollar has been rallying in Q4. One of the things I mentioned about the dollar back over here was that it was likely going to rally for the entirety of Q4, but I also mentioned a couple weeks ago that we would likely see a pullback until the second week of November. And that's what's happening right now, right? I think we are in the pullback by the dollar going into, and I think it might actually tag the bull market support band down here and then start to move up again mid to late November. That's what I think is going to happen. That's exactly what happened in 2016, in fact, right? It got a really strong rally starting in October, and then it pulled back as the election came in. And then the second week of November, the dollar started to rally once again, and then it didn't top out until the first week of January. And it was during that rally by the dollar that the altcoin market struggled with respect to Bitcoin. the long end of the yield curve also went up after the election results were in. If you were to go look at the 10-year yield back in 2016, what you'll notice is that the long end went up a lot at the very end of 2016. Right here. You see this move by the 10-year yield? It really started moving here in October, and it increased from 1.6% to 2.6% between October and December. So from when October started, the 10-year yield increased by about 65%, right? From 1.6 to 2.6. If you were to look at it today, since this rally began, it's already increased 20 to 21%. And the reason why the long end rallying is something to at least consider is because when the long end rallied in 2022 and in 2023, it did set Bitcoin back slightly, right? It did set it back a little bit. You can see obviously Bitcoin had a drop over here in late 2022, and then during this rally, it had this drop right there in sort of Q3 of 2023. And it didn't really start going again until after it was more clear that the 10-year yield was sort of dropping back down. Okay. So I just want to put that out there as one potential outcome, that following the election, there's going to be a lot of really bold calls as to what will happen. And what I think could happen is a drop sometime in early December that scares people. And I think it might be around the time of the labor market release. What is unclear to me right now is whether that drop by Bitcoin is just back testing this and then going up in 2025, or if it's back testing down here and then going up. That is what I still remain somewhat unsure of. Because while it would seem likely that if ETH goes down in Q4, Bitcoin would have to go down too, Q4 2016 would clearly refute that point. And so far, if you look at quarterly returns in Q4 of 2024, Bitcoin is already up 10%, while Ethereum is down 5.7%. So that is proof alone that you don't actually have to see Bitcoin go down for ETH to go down, because so far this quarter, Bitcoin has been going up while ETH has been going down. If the cyclical view does not confirm with, say, a couple weekly closes above 70K, right? If it doesn't confirm and the monetary policy view prevails, I don't want people to think that the cycle has to technically be over. There is an example where it's not, okay? If you're not aware of what I'm talking about, I'm just referring to the idea that last cycle, the Fed cut rates in July of 2019, and then a couple months later, Bitcoin fell to its 100-week moving average, okay? That's the monetary policy view, right? Where the Fed cut here, and then 2 months later, Bitcoin found itself at the 100-week moving average, where it just connected the lower part of this trend line again. So if you connect this trend line into these wicks by Bitcoin, right? If you connect this trend line here into these wicks that Bitcoin has formed, remember how Ethereum formed it in 2016? It was April, August, and December. For Bitcoin in 2024, it has also been so far the same as ETH, April and August. Here is your April wick. Here is your August wick. So if Bitcoin cannot confirm the cyclical view, right? If this just ends up being another, fake out wick above this level, and then we find ourselves below it again later this week, and Bitcoin does fall back down here by December, then note that the support level will likely just simply be the same support level that it had in 2019, and that would be the 100-week moving average. So I just want people to be aware of that outcome, because I could envision a scenario where after, the political outcomes are all decided, if Bitcoin doesn't immediately move up and then it starts to crash, people might assume that the cycle is over, but it could very well just simply be the soft landing scenario that also happened in 2019. That doesn't mean that you won't have a recession. It just means that, perhaps the recession is further off, right? What if you get a soft landing and then, Bitcoin was starting to go up here and then we got the pandemic, which caused it to immediately go down? You could get a situation where, Bitcoin sort of falls here and then rallies on up to new all-time highs in 2025 and then doesn't really start to come down until the unemployment rate is potentially much higher. And maybe it doesn't happen until sort of the end of 2025, beginning of 2026, which is when it normally does. So just something to consider, right? Something to consider. I did a poll recently where I asked people, where's Bitcoin going to go first, 40K or 100K? And the results were 75% of people said 100K first. And of course, 25% said 40K. And while there are times, many times, where the majority gets it right, oftentimes you at least have to wonder, when it's skewed that much, are we missing something, right? Are we missing something? And the only thing that I feel like the market might be missing is not that there's a recession necessarily going to happen imminently, but that the last time that Bitcoin had this drop right here was when around the time that the 2-year and the 10-year yields uninverted. So if you were to go look at the Macroverse and we were to go look at treasury yield spreads, remember when the 2-year yield uninverted the 10-year yield, this occurred, I believe it was back in August, or at least the process was occurring back in August, right? You can see that the process, the uninversion really took place here in August of 2024. And that's when Bitcoin had that drop in August of 2024. And so if there is one final scare later this year, then I wonder if it's going to be caused by the uninversion process of the 3-month and the 10-year, right? Because that process is almost complete. They're only about 24 basis points from uninversion, and it seems likely with the long end rallying and the 3-month is likely going to keep going down because the Fed's going to likely keep cutting interest rates. As you can see, the market expects there's a 98.8% chance they cut interest rates by 25 basis points in 2 days. So if that is the case, right? If that is the case and the Fed cuts rates again in 2 days and they give guidance, right? The 3-month will likely continue to drop, right? Just like it's been dropping. And it makes sense for it to drop, right? The Fed controls the short end of the curve. They don't control the long end. So if the Fed cuts interest rates and then they give the guidance that they're going to continue cutting in December, then we'll likely see the 3-month drop. But you'll notice that the 3-month yield is at 4.548%. And the 10-year yield is at 4.343%, right? There's not a large gap there. In fact, the website that I just showed you, it just looks at daily closes. But if we were to go look at this on a lower time frame, just sort of what's going on intraday, you can see that it's actually less than 21 basis points from uninverting. So I'm just saying it's not the monetary policy view still technically could happen, right? It could. It doesn't have to. And what I would argue is that if we can get some weekly closes above 70K, it would go a long ways in helping to sort of confirm the monetary, or if it would help confirm the cyclical view. But it seems like just about every week, everyone keeps screaming that we're going to get a weekly close above 70K, and then it just keeps on not happening. And I'm with you with the idea that it looks like Bitcoin has broken out when you sort of connect these wicks like that. If you connect the first wick with that wick up there, you could argue that it's, maybe this is the week. Maybe this is the week where it finally durably breaks out. But we will have to, in fact, see by the end of the week. So I think a lot of people are focusing on the election results, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. It is important, right, to go vote, right? That's an important part. It's an important thing to do. But also, there's other parts of the market that we should not ignore, right? We still have FOMC on Thursday, and we still have a yield curve that's likely going to uninvert. One thing I could see happening, I've said this a few times, I just want to put it out there once again. I could see this happening. I could see Bitcoin getting a drop around the time that the 3-month and the 10-year uninverts. From what level that is, I don't know. I don't know if it'll just be sort of back testing this or if it'll be checking in with this trend line down here one last time around the 100-week moving average and finally taking ETH home. But whatever it is, right, I think that you'll get a scare around that time, and then people will think that it means recession is immediate, and it could be a nasty drop, right? But there are times where you see the uninversion and the recession is still several months away, and a lot can happen in the markets in those several months. So just something to consider, right? If you go look at treasury yield spreads with a 3-month and the 10-year yield, there are times like in, say, 89 where it uninverted in December of 89, but the recession didn't actually begin until July of 1990, right? It took another half year for it to actually arrive. If you were to look at the 07 era, you can see that the yield curve, the 3-month uninverted the 10-year in May of 2007, but the recession didn't actually occur until about half a year later. So my argument is that you could have a scare around the time of the uninversion of the 3-month and the 10-year yield, but it doesn't have to mean the recession is immediate. There are cases in the past where it has been immediate, right? Where like as the uninversion process is happening, the recession has already arrived. And I've wondered a lot about that outcome as well, sort of the 1980 to 1981 outcome, where you sort of get a brief drop, as it gets close to uninverting, and then a longer drop, but not as bad, about a year later. So just remember that the business cycle is a very long process. It does not take place over weeks or months. It takes place over multiple years. So, as always with financial markets, hope for the best, plan for the worst. Have a strategy, right? Don't base your strategy on my thoughts in this video. I would say it makes more sense to DCA Bitcoin at risk levels that you are comfortable with. That is what I do. I am not buying and selling Bitcoin based on the views I express here, right? I'm not. I'm buying it when the risk metric goes low enough, and I'm selling it when the risk metric goes high enough. Earlier this year, the risk metric got pretty heated over here, so it warranted offloading some. Obviously, with Bitcoin sort of dropping for a while, it allowed for the risk metrics to sort of reset some. They're still not, they're still not that low, but they're also not nearly as high because the markets have sort of digested that move for a while now. So, to sort of summarize, the presidential election will, of course, make people very convinced as to what the outcome of the financial markets will be. But history shows us that while short-term views, short-term moves in the market could certainly be impacted, the history of Bitcoin shows us that it should be able to survive no matter who wins the presidential election. And I do think that that is a view that is probably not expressed enough. But if anyone were to sort of refute that view, just pull up the chart and say, well, show me on here the political party that stopped Bitcoin. And if you can show me that, then I will listen. But if you can't show me that, then why should I listen to that view? To me, this looks like Bitcoin's going to do what it's going to do regardless of who wins the election. So that is my view on the market. I think a lot of people are focused on it, and it's fine. But don't forget, there are other things in the market that do warrant attention, and we should see those play out relatively soon. I'll try to provide the updates on the cyclical versus monetary policy view. It kind of reminds me of sort of like a lot of the pollsters right now are getting a lot of flack because they're not willing to sort of make a bold prediction. And some predictions, some people say that it's, going to be Harris, other people say it's going to be Trump, and then other people just say it's 50-50, right? No one knows. Sometimes that really is the case. I think that's one of those things where people don't really want to believe that that's the case, but sometimes it could come down to something that no one is even thinking about right now. Markets tend to move on events that people are on things that people aren't actually thinking about. They're not necessarily moving on the thing that everyone's focusing on, right? I think that's the biggest thing, is that everyone thinks that, all right, well, everyone's watching the election, therefore Bitcoin's going to do a specific thing based on the election outcome. I think Bitcoin's probably thinking a little bit further ahead than we maybe give it credit for. But anyways, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see who wins the US presidential election, and the short term will likely be impacted, but the long term impact of Bitcoin should not be impacted by whoever wins the election. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.